The Village Without Mirrors. It started as a detour. Eric was driving through the sprawling countryside, the sun dipping low on the horizon, when his GPS lost signal. Tired and hungry, he took the next exit, hoping to find a diner or gas station, but instead he stumbled upon the quietest, most peculiar village he had ever seen. A small wooden sign at the entrance read, "Welcome to Eldermere." From the first moment, something felt wrong. The cobblestone streets were eerily clean, lined with neatly trimmed hedges and pastel-painted houses. There was no traffic, no background hum of life, just the faint whisper of the wind. The people he did see seemed to hurry past, their heads down, faces tight with unease. What struck Eric almost immediately, though, was the complete absence of reflective surfaces. No mirrors, no shiny windows, not even a glinting bumper on a parked car. At first, he shrugged it off as a quirk of the town's aesthetic. Maybe it was one of those old-fashioned villages, meant to feel like a step back in time. But the more he looked around, the more deliberate it all seemed, almost obsessive. The glass panes in shop windows were frosted, their surfaces dulled with a filmy glaze. Even the street signs were matte, painted in subdued, non-reflective colors. Curiosity piqued. Eric pulled into the parking lot of what appeared to be the town's only diner. The sign above the door read, "Haven Cafe," its letters hand-painted in faded red. A little bell jingled as he pushed the door open. Inside, the atmosphere wasn't much better. The few patrons seated in booths barely glanced up, their eyes darting quickly back to their plates. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with graying hair tied into a messy bun, approached him cautiously. Her name tag read Margaret. "Coffee?" she asked, her voice clipped but polite. Sure," Eric replied, sliding into a booth by the window. As he sat, he realized even the windows inside the diner were smudged to the point of opacity. "Actually, can I ask you something?" Margaret hesitated, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Depends on the question. What's with the no mirrors thing? I mean, it's kind of noticeable." The room seemed to freeze. A man at the counter coughed awkwardly into his sleeve, and a young couple in the corner exchanged uneasy glances. Margaret's smile tightened. "Just the way things are here," she said curtly, placing a chipped mug of coffee in front of him. "Cream and sugars on the table? Anything else?" Eric shook his head, watching as she hurried back behind the counter. The whole interaction only fueled his curiosity. As he stirred sugar into his coffee, an older man sitting nearby leaned over. He had a kind but weary face, his eyes shadowed with something Eric couldn't quite place. "You're not from around here, are you?" the man asked quietly. "Nope, just passing through," Eric said, offering a friendly smile. "What's the deal with this place? Everyone seems a little on edge." The man glanced around nervously before leaning closer. "There's a reason we don't have mirrors," he whispered. "And if you're smart, you'll leave before you find out why." Eric blinked, unsure if the man was joking. But before he could ask anything else, the man stood abruptly, tossing a few crumpled bills onto the counter and walking out without another word. For a moment, Eric considered taking his advice. The place had a strange energy, and the last thing he wanted was to end up in the middle of some small-town drama. But something about the man's warning, and the way everyone seemed so unnaturally tense, kept him glued to his seat. After finishing his coffee, Eric decided to walk around the village. The streets were just as unnervingly quiet as before. He passed a row of houses with heavy curtains drawn over every window. A group of kids playing in a yard stopped and stared at him until he was out of sight. Eventually, he found himself in the village square, where a small fountain gurgled softly in the center. On a nearby bench sat a woman, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She looked up as he approached, her expression cautious but curious. "You're not from here," she said, her voice low. "No," Eric admitted, sitting down beside her. "What's with this town? Everyone seems scared of something." The woman hesitated, her fingers twisting nervously. "It's not something," she said finally. "It's someone." Eric frowned. "Who?" Her gaze flicked toward the fountain, and for a brief moment, Eric thought he saw something move in the water's surface, a flicker of light, like a reflection. But when he looked closer, it was gone. "They say she lives in the mirrors," the woman whispered, her voice barely audible. "Or she did once, before we got rid of them." "She?" The woman nodded, her eyes wide with fear. "The mirror woman. She's not human. Not anymore. They say if you see her, if she sees you, she'll take your reflection. And once she does, she takes you too. Eric stared at her, unsure whether to laugh or take her seriously. It sounded like something out of a campfire story, a way to keep kids from misbehaving. But the woman's expression was dead serious, her fear palpable. "That's why we don't have mirrors," she continued. "It's the only way to keep her out." Eric couldn't help but glance over his shoulder, a shiver running down his spine despite the warm evening air. He wanted to tell himself it was just a legend, a silly superstition. But deep down, something about the story unsettled him. "Has anyone ever seen her?" he asked. The woman didn't answer. Instead, she stood abruptly, her hands shaking as she clutched her coat. "You should leave," she said, her voice trembling, "before it's too late." And with that, she hurried away, leaving Eric alone in the square. Eric spent the rest of the evening trying to shake off the strange encounters. He wandered back to the diner, but it was closed, its windows dark and uninviting. The streets were eerily empty now, the only sound the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. With nowhere else to go, he returned to his car, planning to drive through the night and put Eldermere behind him. But as he turned the key in the ignition, the engine sputtered and died. He tried again. Nothing. His frustration grew as he checked the gas gauge. Full. He popped the hood and fiddled with the engine, though he had no idea what he was looking for. After 20 minutes of failed attempts, he gave up. "Of course," he muttered under his breath. The village seemed even quieter now, as if it were holding its breath. Reluctantly, Eric grabbed his bag and headed for the small inn he'd noticed earlier near the edge of town. It was a creaky old building with ivy crawling up its walls and a sign that read Eldermere Lodge in faded gold lettering. The innkeeper, a wiry man with a thin mustache, greeted him with a wary look. "You're stranded, I take it," he said. "Yeah, car trouble," Eric replied. "Do you have a room for the night?" The man nodded slowly. "We do. But I'd suggest you leave first thing in the morning. This isn't the kind of place you want to stay longer than you have to." Eric forced a laugh. "Let me guess, this is about the mirrors?" The innkeeper didn't respond, his expression grim as he handed over a key. "Room 7, end of the hall." Eric thanked him and climbed the creaking staircase to his room. It was small but clean, with a single bed, a nightstand, and a wardrobe. As expected, there was no mirror, not even in the bathroom. He shrugged it off and flopped onto the bed, exhaustion overtaking his curiosity. He had just started to drift off when he heard it. A faint, rhythmic tapping. His eyes snapped open, heart racing as he listened. The sound was coming from the wardrobe. Eric sat up slowly, every nerve in his body on edge. "Hello?" he called out, half hoping it was just his imagination. The tapping continued, steady and deliberate. Summoning what little courage he had, Eric crossed the room and yanked the wardrobe door open. It was empty. His pulse pounded as he searched the wardrobe, knocking on its back panel to see if it was hollow. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, but the tapping had stopped the moment he opened the door. "Great," he muttered, closing it again. He turned back to the bed and froze. On the nightstand, where there had been nothing but a lamp and an empty glass, now sat a small antique mirror. Eric stared at it, his breath catching in his throat. He was sure it hadn't been there before. Slowly, he approached, his reflection growing clearer in the glass as he leaned closer. For a moment, everything seemed normal. Then, his reflection blinked. Eric stumbled back, his heart hammering in his chest. His reflection remained motionless, its eyes locked on his, its expression wrong. It wasn't him. "Leave," it whispered, lips moving soundlessly. Eric's knees buckled as the lamp flickered, casting strange shadows across the room. The air grew heavy, oppressive, as if something unseen was pressing down on him. He grabbed the mirror, intending to hurl it across the room, but the glass felt searingly hot, burning his palms. He dropped it with a cry, and it shattered on the floor. The oppressive weight lifted instantly, the room returning to normal as if nothing had happened. But Eric knew better. He didn't sleep that night, his eyes fixed on the door, half expecting the tapping to return. When dawn finally broke, he bolted from the inn without even stopping to check out. The streets were still deserted as he made his way back to his car, praying it would start this time. To his relief, the engine roared to life on the first try. Eric didn't waste a second, speeding out of Eldermere and back onto the open road. But as he drove, he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. Every so often, he glanced in his rearview mirror, half expecting to see something, or someone, sitting in the back seat. By the time he reached the next town, he was trembling. He pulled into a gas station and stumbled inside, desperate for human interaction. The attendant, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, greeted him warmly. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said, handing him a bottle of water. Eric managed a weak laugh. "You have no idea." As he turned to leave, his eyes caught a small mirror hanging behind the counter. For a fleeting moment, he thought he saw something move, a flicker of a shadow that didn't belong. He didn't stick around to find out. Weeks passed, but Eric couldn't shake the memories of Eldermere. At night, he'd wake in a cold sweat, his dreams haunted by whispers and shadowy reflections. Every reflective surface became a potential threat, a darkened window, a shiny spoon, even the screen of his phone. He started covering mirrors in his apartment and avoided places with too much glass. One evening, as he tried to distract himself with the TV, his phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "Did you see her?" Eric's stomach churned. His fingers hovered over the screen, hesitating before he replied, "Who is this?" The response came almost immediately. "She's still with you." His heart raced as he stared at the message. The room suddenly felt colder, the shadows deeper. He glanced toward the covered mirror in the hallway, a shiver running down his spine. Eric spent the next few days researching Eldermere, determined to find answers. Most searches turned up nothing. No maps, no records, not even a mention of the village. It was as if it didn't exist. But on a late-night forum dedicated to urban legends, he found a thread titled "The Mirror Woman of Eldermere." The stories were chilling. Accounts of travelers who had stumbled into the village, only to leave with strange and terrifying experiences. Some claimed the Mirror Woman was a ghost, the restless spirit of a woman who had died tragically in front of a mirror. Others believed she was something far older, a malevolent entity that could only exist through reflections. One post stood out. "If you've seen her, she'll follow you. The only way to escape is to destroy every reflection she can use. But even then, it might not be enough." Eric leaned back in his chair, the words blurring before his eyes. Destroy every reflection? That seemed impossible. The following night, he noticed something strange. The TV in his living room, though off, had a faint flicker, like static trapped beneath the screen. He approached cautiously, his heart pounding. For a brief moment, he thought he saw a pair of eyes staring back at him. That was the breaking point. Eric grabbed a hammer and shattered the TV, the crash echoing through his apartment. He moved methodically from room to room, breaking mirrors, covering windows, and even scratching the surface of his phone to dull its shine. But no matter how much he destroyed, the sense of being watched never left him. One evening, he awoke to the sound of tapping again. This time, it was coming from his closet. He didn't hesitate. Grabbing a baseball bat, he swung the door open, ready to fight. The closet was empty, but the tapping persisted, louder now. It was coming from the floor-length mirror he had forgotten to cover. Her face was there, clear as day. Pale and hollow-eyed, she stared at him with a twisted grin. Her lips didn't move, but he heard her voice, a low, guttural whisper that echoed in his mind. "You can't hide forever." In a frenzy, Eric smashed the mirror to pieces, the shards scattering across the floor. The whispering stopped, but the damage was done. He could feel her presence stronger than ever, like a shadow clinging to his every step. Eric knew then that there was no escaping her. Eldermere had marked him, and no matter where he went or what he did, she would always be watching. The last thing he saw before he left his apartment for good was his reflection in a shard of glass. But it wasn't his face staring back. It was hers, smiling. Eric abandoned his apartment and hit the road, hoping distance might weaken her hold. He drove for hours through cities and barren highways, avoiding reflective surfaces at all costs. He slept in his car, kept his phone off, and avoided talking to anyone for fear they might see her too. Weeks passed in this restless state. Eric was a shadow of himself, gaunt and paranoid, jumping at every flicker of movement in his periphery. But one night, as he parked at a desolate rest stop, a strange sense of calm washed over him. The night was unusually quiet. The air felt heavier, charged, as though the world was holding its breath. Eric stepped out of the car, stretching his legs. The rest stop had a single restroom building with peeling paint and a dim, flickering light above the door. Against his better judgment, he walked toward it. The restroom was empty, save for a single sink and mirror. Eric froze when he saw it. The mirror was cracked, its surface warped and dirty, but it was a mirror nonetheless. He backed away, but a faint sound stopped him in his tracks. A hum, low and rhythmic, like a pulse. Before he could react, the lights flickered and went out. Panic surged as he fumbled for his flashlight, the darkness pressing in around him. When the beam finally clicked on, it illuminated the mirror. Her face was there, clearer than ever, filling the entire glass. Her eyes locked onto his, her grin widening as her hand pressed against the inside of the mirror as if trying to break through. "Eric," she whispered, her voice crawling into his mind. He stumbled back, dropping the flashlight. It rolled across the floor, casting wild shadows that danced along the walls. Eric turned to run, but the door slammed shut, trapping him inside. "No!" he shouted, banging on the door. The hum grew louder, deafening, as the mirror began to shatter outward in slow, deliberate cracks. Pieces of glass rained onto the floor, yet her image remained, her eyes following him no matter where he moved. "You can't run," she said, her voice like nails scraping against his thoughts. "You're mine now." Desperation clawed at Eric as he picked up a shard of broken mirror. Without thinking, he plunged it into the reflection, screaming as the glass cut into his hands. The room erupted in a burst of light and sound, a cacophony of whispers and laughter that made his head spin. He fell to his knees, clutching his bleeding hands as the noise faded into silence. When he finally opened his eyes, the mirror was gone. The room was empty, the door slightly ajar. Eric stumbled outside, the cold night air hitting him like a wave. He collapsed onto the pavement, gasping for breath, his mind racing. Was it over? Had he won? As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, he allowed himself to hope. But as he looked down at his hands, he saw something that froze him in place. Reflected in the tiny droplets of blood on his skin were not his eyes, but hers. Eric screamed, the sound swallowed by the vast emptiness around him. No matter where he went or what he did, he couldn't escape her. The mirror woman wasn't just following him anymore. She was inside him. The days that followed were a blur of terror and confusion. Eric could no longer trust what he saw or what others saw in him. Reflections of her would appear in the smallest of places, a glint in a puddle, the screen of a darkened phone, the shine of a polished spoon. And every time she appeared, she seemed closer, her presence more tangible. Eric felt her in his mind, a cold, invasive presence, whispering thoughts that weren't his own. At first, he tried to fight it, to push her out, but her voice grew louder and stronger, drowning out his own. "You've been running for so long," she said one night, her voice resonating in his head like an echo. "Why fight me? Why resist what's already yours?" Eric barely recognized himself anymore. His body was thinner, his movements slower, as if his very essence was being drained. The people around him, when he dared venture out, would give him strange looks, avoiding eye contact. Once, a child pointed at him and screamed, "His eyes! They're all wrong." But it wasn't just strangers who noticed. On the rare occasions Eric reached out to the few friends he had left, their reactions were even worse. One by one, they distanced themselves, refusing to take his calls or answer his messages. One evening, he turned on his laptop, desperate to find answers, and began researching urban legends, folklore, and anything that could explain what was happening. The stories he found only deepened his dread. Tales of spirits trapped in mirrors, cursed objects, and entities that could latch onto the living like parasites. But one account stood out. A forum post from a man describing a woman with dark eyes and a predatory grin, who haunted reflections. He claimed she had been a person once, a woman who had been wronged, her anger and pain binding her to the world through the reflective surfaces she once despised. She feeds on regret. The post read, "The more guilt you carry, the stronger she becomes." Eric's chest tightened as he read those words. He thought of his ex-girlfriend, of the argument that ended their relationship, of the nights he spent drowning in guilt, wishing he could take it all back. The man's final warning sent a chill down Eric's spine. If you see her, it's already too late. The only way to stop her is to confront the source of your guilt and let go. Eric knew what he had to do, though it terrified him. He had to face her, to confront the regrets he had buried so deeply. He packed a bag and set off for his hometown, the place where it all began. The journey was fraught with her presence. She whispered to him through the radio static, appeared in the reflection of road signs, and even lingered in the glint of his own eyes in the rearview mirror. "You can't fix this," she hissed. "You're mine." But Eric pressed on, his resolve strengthening with every mile. He arrived late at night, parking in front of the house where he and his ex, Megan, had lived together. The windows were dark, the house silent, but the weight of their past hung in the air. He knocked on the door, half expecting no answer. But after a few moments, the porch light flickered on, and Megan appeared, her face a mix of shock and caution. "Eric?" she said, her voice tinged with disbelief. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice trembling. "Please, it's important." Reluctantly, she let him in. They sat in the living room, the silence between them heavy. Eric struggled to find the words, but when he finally spoke, they poured out in a rush, a confession of his guilt, his regret, and the things he had never said. Megan listened, her expression softening as the truth unraveled. When he finished, she reached out and placed a hand on his. "I forgave you a long time ago," she said softly. "You need to forgive yourself." For the first time in months, Eric felt a glimmer of peace, but it was short-lived. Behind Megan, in the reflection of a darkened window, the mirror woman appeared, her grin stretching impossibly wide. Eric's breath caught. "She's here," he whispered. Megan turned, but the reflection was gone. The air in the room grew colder, the shadows darker. Eric stood, his fists clenched. "You want me? Then take me," he said, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. The room seemed to warp around him, the walls bending and twisting as the mirror woman's laughter filled the space. She stepped out of the shadows, her form no longer confined to reflections. "You think this ends with you?" she sneered. "It never ends." But Eric wasn't afraid anymore. He reached for Megan's hand, their fingers intertwining as he faced the entity head-on. "I'm done running," he said. The mirror woman lunged, her form dissolving into a cloud of black smoke that swirled around them. But instead of consuming him, the smoke dissipated, the room returning to stillness. Eric collapsed onto the couch, gasping for air. When he looked at the window, the reflection was just that, a simple pane of glass showing their weary but determined faces. He had faced his guilt, and for now, she was gone. But as Eric and Megan sat in the quiet of the night, they both knew one thing: shadows linger where light dares to shine, and some reflections never truly fade.